This video is sponsored by Surfshark. Under Michael Carrick, Man United have been completely transformed. In fact, in a head-to-head against Ruben Amorim, there is no doubt who's done better. Carrick has more points per game, and a first in the league since his appointment. So everything points to Carrick being the best choice to lead Man United next season. But when you look at the underlying statistics, this drastic improvement doesn't actually make much sense. In fact, compared to Amorim, Man United are creating fewer chances. They're conceding more chances, they have less possession, and are averaging less touches in the opponent's box. But it gets even weirder. This is Man United's goal difference per game compared to their expected goal difference from the same time period. And while the result is clear for everyone to see, under Carrick, Man United are vastly overperforming their expected goal difference. Of course, XG alone doesn't decide football matches, and the only thing we all care about is how many times the ball actually hits the back of the net. But the reason why this is important is that history tells us that this level of overperformance is unlikely to be sustainable. So while it might all look great for Carrick right now, in this video we need to understand whether we should be concerned about this data, and whether the system being implemented by Carrick is actually the best solution for Man United. So there's a lot of different reasons that can help us pinpoint this gap in the metrics, but the first thing that we need to understand is what's actually changed on the pitch compared to Ruben Amorim. Under Ruben Amorim, it felt like the only thing that was ever spoken about was the system. Regardless of the result, there was one thing that was not up for discussion, and that was the 3-4-3. The main premise in possession was to stretch the pitch as much as possible with the wingbacks on the flank creating a line of 5 against the opposition's defence, and to then find combinations in the centre, either playing the ball directly in behind or then moving possession out wide. This did make it relatively easy for United to circulate possession from flank to flank, which is why they had decent possession metrics under Amorim. And with a lot of rotation in the centre with this box midfield, they could often build their attacks relatively comfortably and go straight through the middle. The last goal under Amorim against Leeds I think is a great example of how this system could expose a team's back line. We see this 3-2-5 shape, with Sesko laying the ball off into the inside forward Xerxes, and the other inside forward Cunha attacking the space left by Sesko dragging away the centre back. However, just as quickly as it could create a dangerous opportunity, the opposition could just as easily stop them from progressing. Most of the time, the ball would end up moving out wide to either wingback and circulating from side to side. But because the back three remained deeper and the two holding midfielders were not always close enough to support the move, the wingbacks could often become isolated, with very few options available. This usually left United either forcing a cross into the box, trying to dribble down the line, or simply restarting the attack, which made a lot of their possession feel repetitive and predictable, even when they were progressing the ball forward. In attack, generally speaking, the issue wasn't the system itself, but that the players weren't the right fit for this style of play. For example, playing in a 3-4-2-1, your wide players are very often playing left-footed on the left and right-footed on the right, so it's not as easy for them to drift inside and link up play. And your more skillful players are already in a more central position, where if there isn't much space for them to receive the ball, then it can be difficult for them to have a substantial impact. One of the more notable examples was also playing Fernandes as one of the two holding midfielders, but this limited Fernandes' contributions in attack, whilst also not providing enough defensive cover for the team. And one common theme for Man United was the lack of protection in central areas, with the defence being consistently exposed. And I think the defence is what really put the nail in the coffin for Ruben Amorim, and it was far too easy for the opponents to carve right through the heart of this Man United team. Now, everything seems to be going great for Michael Carrick so far, but what's happening at Man United is that the surface level looks amazing, but what's hiding behind the scenes might not be all that great. And that's exactly what happens when you browse the internet without today's sponsor, Surfshark VPN. Most people will assume that because Man United are scoring more, then everything is fine. And these people probably also think that because you're just browsing or using public Wi-Fi, then everything is absolutely fine. But with the amount of hacks and data breaches that are happening recently, your data is a lot more exposed than people realize. And that's why I've started using Surfshark. Especially with the 2026 World Cup coming up, I'm probably going to be traveling quite a lot for football content. So I'll be working from airports, hotels, and using a lot of risky public Wi-Fi. So before I log into anything important, I'll usually switch the VPN on. It encrypts your connection and hides your IP address, which makes your activity much harder to track and keeps your data far more protected. When I'm traveling, Surfshark is also extremely useful for accessing content that is not available in certain locations, which is generally really useful if you want to access content that you usually watch at home when you're traveling. The app itself is extremely easy to use, and with just one account you can protect unlimited devices. So go to surfshark.com/footballmeta or use code footballmeta at checkout to get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN with a 30-day money-back guarantee. Thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. Okay, so let's get back to Carrick. Because while the new manager bounce is definitely real, the tactical changes is what can really tell you if this can last in the long term. Since Carrick's appointment, the starting formation has remained a 4-2-3-1, and the main theme of Carrick's tenure so far seems to be to steady the ship. There has been less rotation in terms of starting players, and the positions make a lot more intuitive sense. Fernandes is the 10, and Mainoo has been reintroduced as the starting holding midfielder alongside Casemiro. But I think the biggest difference emerges in the way Man United are defending. Under Carrick, there is a much more conservative defensive approach. They drop into a mid-block 4-4-2 and are not concerned about aggressively closing down the defenders, but are more focused on shadow marking certain areas and forcing play into positions where they can regain possession. And this works incredibly well for the players United have at their disposal. Cunha, Mbeumo, Diallo and Sesko are all players that want to run into space. They're quick and ready to attack forward. And with players like Casemiro and Fernandes in midfield, Carrick is able to get the most out of these players from counterattacks. In recent games, a lot of their goals have come from these positions. For example, against Liverpool and Brentford, there were some huge occasions that ended up with United having an advantage against the defensive line. With Amorim using an extra defender, it wasn't as straightforward for United to get players forward from counters, and the focus was more on trying to win the ball back early. So on occasion, they did score when regaining possession from the high press. So Amorim definitely had a more proactive approach to defending. However, this approach might not have been so suited to the players Man United had at their disposal, and counters lead much more into the players' qualities. But even in possession, there's some important differences that we need to highlight. One of the biggest changes is where Man United's creative players are positioned. And while in the previous system with Amorim, a lot of the creative talent was already down the middle, with Carrick, they start out wide with the freedom to move into more central positions. This does two things to their attack. It means they have more options when they're out wide, as it's much easier to cut inside or go down the line. And rather than having one player constantly hugging the touchline, with this new setup there is a lot more rotation in these positions, thanks mostly to late runs from the fullbacks. Any attack out wide instantly has a lot more support, and with Fernandes already in a more advanced position, it's done wonders to his attacking output, with 16 of his 27 goal contributions coming under Carrick in 5 games fewer. I think one of the best ways we can explain this more straightforward approach used by Carrick is by taking a look at the change in role from Sesko. With Carrick, his role is a lot more straightforward, and is essentially only being asked to be ready in the box, and isn't required to get involved in build-up and to link play as much as Amorim wanted him to do. In fact, we can see that in the statistics from his recent matches. For example, in the game against Liverpool in which he scored, Sesko only touched the ball 11 times, and 4 times was in the box. This is thanks to Fernandes being more active in front of the defensive line, allowing Sesko to just simply be more present in the box. Compare this to Amorim's last game in charge against Leeds, and Sesko has 50 touches but the same amount of touches in the box, and no goals. So I think that's a great example to understand why we've seen such a drop-off in raw metrics like XG and shots. And that is because essentially under Carrick, Man United are less focused on control in all areas of the pitch. They're happy to sit in a mid-block and wait for the right moment to attack, rather than just circulating possession from flank to flank and getting the ball into the box as much as possible. So the focus has completely shifted from volume to quality. Under Amorim, they were trying to get the ball into the box as much as possible. Under Carrick, they're waiting for the right moment to play a more dangerous pass into the box. All it takes is one killer pass to completely expose the defense, or one mistake from the opposition to set up a dangerous counter. So ultimately, while Carrick certainly has a lower raw XG, this is actually an extremely positive change for Man United, because the players are ending up in easier to convert positions, and Carrick has done extremely well to implement this system. But what about the elephant in the room, which is this huge overperformance? Because, like we mentioned, overperformances like these are certainly not sustainable. In a recent article from the BBC, which is where I got this data from, it highlights how both Aston Villa and Sunderland had similar trajectories this season, before ultimately regressing to the norm. And even if we look at all teams in the Premier League over the past 10 seasons, even the best teams will somewhat overperform their XG difference. But it's not as stark and sustainable as what we're seeing with Carrick in this specific moment. So to answer this, I think both things can be true at the same time. Carrick has certainly implemented a more successful system. The structure makes more sense, the players look more comfortable, and the defense finally looks a lot more solid. But at the same time, the current results probably aren't fully sustainable. This efficiency in front of goal and this level of overperformance in terms of expected goal difference historically tends to regress over time. And if it were to regress back to the norm, then these performances are actually more in line with a mid-table team fighting for a spot in Europe. And I think that's an important distinction to make, because regressing back to this level doesn't necessarily mean that Man United are failing, it just simply means that Man United aren't as good as they currently seem. Right now, everything is going in Man United's favour. Fernandes is producing ridiculous numbers. Sesko and Cunha are finishing at an elite rate. Lamens has transformed the confidence of the whole defence, and the Italian team is playing with far more belief than under Amorim. But the real challenge next season will be whether Carrick can maintain this level once those margins inevitably tighten. So the question isn't whether Carrick has improved Man United, because he certainly has. But the question is whether this is generally the foundation of an elite team, or just a short-term correction that's currently running much hotter than it should be. Let me know your thoughts down below. Do you think this form is sustainable next season, and ultimately who do they need to sign to make sure they can compete in more competitions next year? And thanks again to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. Get 4 extra months of Surfshark VPN with code FootballMeta at checkout.